My name is Sarah Mansour. I'm a research assistant at the Jean Monnet Network on Transatlantic Trade Politics. This is part of a series of interviews for the network called the Transatlantic Trade Videos. We're here today with Dirk de Bièvre, who is a professor of international politics and the chair of the Department of Political Science at the University of Antwerp in Belgium. Welcome, Professor de Bièvre, and thank you for taking the time to speak with us today.
It's a pleasure, Sarah.
Okay, so we'll get right into it. So can you speak to the different types of contentious and politicized trade agreements that we've seen?
Well, yes, indeed. We have seen a lot of political attention going to trade agreements in recent years, which is what we generally call politicization, so that people tend to accord more attention to those things that get talked about. That's what we call politicization. And it is not just a matter of being talked about more, it's also a matter of some of these agreements getting more flack, getting more contestation, getting more opposition. But not all, and that is very special and very interesting in itself, because one would think that trade is something that you are either against or for, or that you have protectionists and free traders, which is a kind of economistic way of looking at it, very fashionable, very normal actually to think about it this way. But it's a bit more complicated than that. It's generally citizens are relatively okay with trade sounds like a good idea. No, it fosters welfare, it fosters wealth, it makes exchange between people advantageous. It makes it possible to have access to lots of goods and services. So in general, people tend to be not so much against free trade as such. But some forms of commercial exchange and with some partners, there are many political actors, citizens, parties, interest groups, civil society organizations that do have serious objections and that oppose and that contest. And this is what we have seen in recent years, indeed, that this has become a matter of a different type of politicization than we have seen in the past.
Okay. So why are some agreements, such as transatlantic deals, for example, contentious and others not?
This actually, at the moment, to be very honest, is somewhat of a riddle, because one would think, this must be easy to explain. It must be the Europeans are somewhat anti-American, and therefore they oppose a trade deal with the US. But if on second sight, you go into this explanation, you go like, yes, but anti-Americanism is nothing new at all. There has always been a particular section of public opinion in Europe that has been skeptical or healthily skeptical or somewhat really antagonistic against the US being too much of an hegemonic oppressive power or whatever. So that is not new at all. There is no market overall secular increase in anti-Americanism in the European Union. Of course, the Trump administration hasn't made the US very popular. Certainly not. It has made it very unpopular as a political system. But to say anti-Americanism has now caused TTIP to fail is a bit strange. And the reason why I'm skeptical about this explanation, and many others with me, also in the consortium of the researchers that we have assembled here in this network, is that actually in those countries where anti-Americanism is quite rampant, think of France, for instance, the opposition to having a trade deal with the US with this strange name of TTIP, the Transatlantic Trade and International Partnership, whatever, a very strange abbreviation soup that people invent for these things. The opposition to TTIP in France was incredibly subdued compared to the gigantic mobilization that has taken place, for instance, against a new World Trade Organization multilateral trade round. Then France was up in arms, like they were going to dismantle the national identity of France's agricultural policy. Whereas in TTIP, actually the organizations were very silent, relatively speaking. Whereas those countries like Germany or Belgium were opposition to TTIP, to having this trade deal with the US, was really very large scale. They are not typically seen as very anti-American dominated national systems in the European Union. So this anti-Americanism explanation doesn't really satisfy us, does it? It's a bit cheap, it's a bit superficial. It's like, let's take a big stick and then think we explained it. And unfortunately, that's not the case. That's why we as a network are now curious to try and embark on a more thorough, deep digging type of explanation.
Okay, so one country that we've seen evidence of politicization of trade agreements is the United States, as you mentioned. And President Donald Trump has made aggressive statements on trade policy, and he's declared trade wars as easy to win. So why has Trump pursued this policy, and how successful has it been?
Well, yes, of course, Trump, Twitter diplomacy is something entirely different from achieving results. And so this has very much been a communication presidency and very little of a policy outcome presidency. Especially in trade policy, this has been very weird. Of course, many things were done, but objectives were not achieved. This is very strange. So it makes it very difficult to make an assessment of the Trump trade policy legacy. Because on the one hand, he did change the world, very clearly. He did engage into a gigantic trade war, the scale of which we haven't seen for at least, the jury's still out, but at least 30 years. And the last real big advanced economies trade war was the US against Japan in the 80s. But this one, in size and political havoc that it created, was of course of a far different nature. Yet, the objectives with which this Trump administration went into this war, trade war, it's a metaphor of course, it's not a war with arms, but it is an economic type of warfare. The objectives with which it went in were actually relatively straightforward and had a large consensus in Washington, in both houses of Congress, in both political parties, the Republican and the Democratic Party, and many allies, as the Trump administration would call them, actually agreed with these objectives. They said, like, yes, it is a problem that there is intellectual property violations in China on large scale. Yes, it is a problem that the state-owned enterprises tend to over-subsidize their exports, and this distorts markets and is actually against what we had agreed upon not doing in the World Trade Organization agreements that China signed on to voluntarily, was not forced to do. And so to get to do away with those with those policies of China was actually a fair and agreed upon objective. But none of these were actually achieved. None. So the only thing that changed in trade politics was that the US closed its borders to many services and many goods coming out of China. And China didn't change its behavior on intellectual property or state-owned subsidization of its exports. So it is kind of saying, well, he achieved a great deal. And at the same time, we could also say, he achieved nothing. So it makes it difficult to talk about, is this a trade war easily won? I don't think so, because it would have been nice, and it would have been better in the interest of both parties to have solved intellectual property theft to some extent, or to have started having a negotiation on that, or to have somehow established criteria upon which to judge when do you over-subsidize, when do you dump goods on the other's market because you have an advantage that is disproportionate. So I think this is where we can say this trade war has been in the end very destructive and has achieved very little in terms of public goods that benefit all the participants of the world trade system.
So you've talked about the position that the U.S. has taken in agreements with different partners, and you say that it has frequently threatened its trading partners with a trade war, as we've just talked about. So they've only fully acted, however, on these threats against China, and partly on Canada and Mexico, but they've never acted against the European Union. So why is that? Why has the United States been able to carry out a trade war against China, but not against the EU?
Yeah, the whole point of engaging in economic warfare, or in trade wars as they are called, is of course to try and obtain something from the other party by threatening, and by hoping that threatening to do something will change the behavior of the other side. And that's one of the ways to look at what a trade war might be intended to do. There might be other motives playing in the margin, but this is generally what we assume is the intention. Now, it is indeed very interesting that the United States had to act upon its threats. So like, if you don't change this and that, we are going to start imposing all kinds of barriers. We're going to try and we're going to really raise tariffs, which is what they did. And they threatened indeed to do the same with the European Union. And you may remember or not all kinds of tweets by the Trump Twitter account saying, we're going to slash tariffs on German cars until they don't appear anymore on Fifth Avenue in front of my Trump Tower. And you go, what is this about? It never happened. It never happened. And I think it is a plausible explanation. I think it is plausible to say that it was the sheer market attractiveness of the European Union as the most important trade partner of the United States in the world, even more important than China. And because China is a source of mass production goods, whereas the European Union is the core and the linchpin of the international trading system in high value goods and in high value added goods and services and in investment relationships. So the mutual investment, transatlantic investment in global value chains and in investment vested interests, invested interests, is far bigger than the interdependence of the Chinese and the American economy. So if firms then started banging on the Congress doors and on the administration's doors, like, are you mad? Are you out of your mind to say that you're going to start slashing tariffs and imposing all kinds of trade barriers between the European Union and the US? This is going to cause real big havoc and real big harm to employment, investment, firm survival. This is going to be really big. And so what the European Union did when the Trump administration said, well, we have this threat, we could slash tariffs on your stupid German cars coming out of the European Union, which we don't like, we want to have Detroit cars on our roads. Then the European Commission tabled a list of 150 items on which they would impose in retaliation, proportionate to exactly what Trump was threatening to do. Immediately, like one day after they would have done it, they would immediately put up the same type of wall of protectionist tariffs on all kinds of goods that would hurt swing state districts, employment and investment targeted at the swing electoral districts of the Trump electoral victory. And it's exactly those states that actually now, ironically, went again as swing states. They swung back to the Biden Democrats. So it is because of the symmetry and the enormous interdependence of the European Union and the US as economies that I think this worst case scenario of having to act upon the threat of sanctions in this trade war logic was avoided.
Okay, so moving on to focus more on the EU a little bit. Does the EU's multi-level policy-making system contribute to or hinder its power in trade negotiations? And how does it come into play with respect to the politicization of trade agreements, particularly in transatlantic deals?
I think they're incredibly intertwined. So one of the classical critiques of the European Union, very understandably, in trade policy is that, whom should we talk to? They never speak with one voice, do they? Actually, they do, but they are very hard to talk to because they are very stubborn. Why are they very stubborn in trade negotiations or trade relations? It's because there has to be an enormous amount of agreement among member states before the Commission can say, this is our stance. Now, this has a very weird effect, namely that the most recalcitrant, the most stubborn, and the most demanding member state is able to impose what the Commission should be saying to the US. That means if something is not agreeable to France, or if something is not agreeable to Belgium, or the Walloon Parliament, which in constitutional Belgium has a veto power over trade policy, well, then it doesn't pass. Because that one member state can say, we don't agree, we want even more concessions from the US, we want them to do this and that and that. And it's exactly what happened in the relationship with Canada. At some point, there was disagreement about a particular investment court system, and there were extra demands voiced by the member states, and Canada just had to swallow them at the risk of not having any type of trade agreement with the European Union. So the very weird effect of member states having a lot of power over what the Commission then has to say and cannot say makes the European Union a very disagreeable, very stubborn and boring negotiating partner that has enormous power at the table. This commissioner comes to Washington or to Canberra or to Ottawa and says, look, I would like to give you a lot, yet I have all these member states behind me. They ask very difficult things from me. Forgive me. Well, let's have a beer later tonight, but I would be wanting to give you all kinds of nice things, but these member states, you know what? And of course, this is great for the Commission negotiator because he or she has enormous power. You can always say, oh, it's the member states, not me. I am of goodwill, they are not. And this, of course, is a political game that is very dangerous for administrations or other countries that want to obtain something from the European Union. They lose. As long as they really want a free trade agreement with the European Union, because it's a large market, it's a lucrative market, it's a very stable market, then you'll have to swallow all kinds of concessions that you don't really like, yet you go like, let's swallow it, let's accept it, but grudgingly. And let's accuse them of these stupid Europeans of being incredibly protectionists, which of course they are not. But this is the way that then in public discourse this is sold, like, these member states, always the same with them, isn't it? But they just maximize their power because they can. So it is a very strange effect of member states being incredibly able to impose their will on what the European Commission can negotiate and what it cannot negotiate, putting the Commission also in a very comfortable position, like, we can demand anything. Anything, by just a manner of speaking. Yet the other side of this is, of course, that as soon as there is politicization, what we started our conversation about earlier at the beginning of this talk, if there is contestation in one or several member states, of course, this also has an impact on what the Commission is able to negotiate. And if then Austria or Belgium in the national parliament says, we don't want any free trade agreement anymore with Canada or with Mercosur, because the Brazilians keep cutting down the rainforest, we don't want to reward that. Well, then the Commission all of a sudden, boom, has nothing it can demand anymore. So it is two sides of the same coin. It's because member states have such enormous control powers over the Commission as their negotiator, that contestation of a particular trade agreement can also then lead to the total collapse of it. This is actually a bit surprisingly what happened in the transatlantic partnership agreement that was under negotiation with the US. It was Austria, then France, then Germany, then Belgium, killing the mandate that the Commission had been given a couple of years before. Like, no, we changed our minds. We don't want it. And then there's no mandate anymore. There is no negotiation. It's dead. So contestation in one or several member states is sufficient. A minority in the European Union can kill a prospective trade agreement.
Okay, so what do you hope to achieve through this research, and in your opinion, how do you think that better understanding the politicization of trade agreements will help policymakers, businesses, and civil society in the future?
What we are very keen on achieving in this is to try and solve this riddle of some agreements getting incredibly contested, like the one with the US, but some others, like the European Union trade negotiations with Japan or with Vietnam, being subject to no significant contestation whatsoever. That's one. So there is a clear difference between types of agreements. And I mean, the one with Japan, you can't say, it's small beer, it's not important, it's about peanuts, nobody cares. No, this is a huge market. This is about huge economic interests. One would assume that lobbies cared, right? And that people being opposed to too much liberalization and too much mutual standards recognition that are also typical of this type of agreements would oppose this. But they didn't. They shut up. They mobilized against TTIP and didn't mobilize against Japan. We find this riddling. We would like to get to the bottom of that. That's the first. The second thing that we would really like to solve is within the European Union, some member states saw a lot of contestation and others didn't. Like the Scandinavians and the Mediterranean countries, they were appalled by the opposition to TTIP. They went like, liberalization with the US, bring it on. It's great, everybody agreed. And one cannot say, but it was because they didn't care about the environment, and it's because they didn't care about labor standards, and it's because they didn't care about food standards. No, come on. The Scandinavian countries are known to have extremely high environmental standards, to have enormously high social and welfare condition standards, and to have very well-functioning health standard systems. And they were all like, well, we don't see any problem. There is mutual recognition, but there is also benchmarks which we will never lower, and so particular types of food, particular types of goods, particular types of potentially environmentally unfriendly goods will just not enter the market because we have European regulation on that and we totally trust this. We don't see any problem. Whereas in other member countries, there was a big outcry like, oh, this is going to undermine the health and safety standards and the agricultural food culture of Europe. So we go like, there's something very strange going on here. So it must be due to political reasons, to institutional reasons. And this is the route that we would like to go down. Like, see how come that some opinions got voiced more vocally in some member states, whereas they did not gain that traction in other member states. And we have a suspicion that this might be due to the constitutive role of how these economies are organized. And we tend to have, or we have this typology of political systems that makes a distinction between liberal market economies and coordinated market economies. There are many labels for this. There is consociationalism, a horribly ugly word, but a very useful word to say that these are very consensual systems in which all kinds of actors have a decisive say in government policy making. Both within firms, their firms have systems of co-gestion, of co-determination, trade unions and employers and employer organizations. And at the national level, the fact that these are very consensual democracies. Germany, Austria, and Belgium, they are very much political systems that require large governmental majorities to have any kind of decision. Whereas the so-called more liberal or less coordinated market economies like the Mediterranean countries, or like the United Kingdom, a very extreme case of totally liberal market economy type of state. There you don't need so many people to agree on something to have it as a government policy. So this is why we suspect that this is the route to go down, and to try and explain why you can get such striking differences in contestation of exactly the same trade agreement that would have benefited, economically at least, these countries quite similarly.
Okay, so that ends our interview for today. And again, thank you, Professor de Bièvre, for joining us.
It was a pleasure.